The parable of the talents is one of the best parables there is. In fact, when you understand what Jesus was doing, you'll never think of this parable in the same way again. The last time I taught on this parable, one of the reactions I got was, wow! So I'm going to break down this parable for you and show you what most people miss. This way, you won't be one of them. The parable of the talents is in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. It's 17 verses, but very simple to follow and understand on the surface. This is right after Jesus has given the parable of the 10 virgins. 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. As you read through the chapter, it's hard not to start this parable thinking how important it is to be wise. This sets the stage in a great way for the parable of the talents. Jesus begins the parable by saying in verse 14, "For as a man travelling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods." God's kingdom is like a man travelling into a far country. The man is Jesus. He's preparing people for his return. He describes the journey as into a far country. This shows us there is a period in which he will be away. It's actually funny how some people accuse Jesus of returning fast when he gave parables like this. But the verse says he calls his servants and delivers them his goods. To help you understand this, picture a wealthy businessman giving out his goods to his staff. The first key most people miss about this parable is at the end of the verse. It says he gave unto them his goods. Most don't think about what kind or how valuable those goods are. God's goods are precious, valuable, and ones worth desiring. You'll see why this matters in a moment. Once you understand this, the whole point of the parable of the talents takes on a far greater meaning. In case you missed the point, the goods given are precious. Jesus spells it out for you in the next verse. In verse 15, Jesus says, "And unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2 talents, and to another 1. To every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey." Jesus mentions 3 people. One received 5 talents, one received 2 talents, and the third man received 1 talent. Most read over this and assume this is a small amount of goods. They think this is a small amount of money, but they'd be wrong. Very wrong. Once you understand what he gave them, it changes everything. The people hearing this parable, they knew what a talent was. It's no surprise Matthew shared this parable, but I'll talk about that later. 1 talent was equal to 6,000 denarii. To give you some context, 1 dinar was an average day's wage. 1 dinar was the average day's wage of a farmer, someone along those lines, for example. So it's like how $100 today is how much someone waiting tables gets, and so forth. 1 talent equals 6,000 times the average day's wage. And this is what the third person got. To simplify this for you even more, 1 talent was equal to about 16 to 20 years worth of wages. 16 to 20 years of wages. So the first guy received about 100 years of wages. The second 40 years worth of wages. And the third only received 20 years worth of wages. And obviously I say only 20 years of wages in jest, but most people think these are small goods. This is why catching the point in the first verse about the goods being the man's is critical. I'm sure you're looking at this parable in a different way now, aren't you? But the verse says more. Everyone is given according to their ability. This man is no fool. He wouldn't give something to someone who cannot handle it. Then he would be to blame. But he gives everyone what they can handle. Then Jesus said, the man straightway took his journey, meaning he gave the men his goods and left immediately. He did not wait around. Then in verse 16 it says, "Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made other 5 talents. He multiplied those wages into more." Notice he didn't say what he has was enough or too much. He took it and multiplied it. Verse 17 is more of the same. It says, "And likewise he that too, he also gained other 2. Like the man given 100 years of wages, the man given 40 years of wages multiplied the goods too." There's so much practical application here, but I'm going to save that for the end. So far, the 2 with the most goods multiplied it. Now look at the third person in verse 18. "But he that had received 1 went and digged in the earth and hid his Lord's money." Notice it says he hid his Lord's money. This reminds you the goods were given by his Lord. I remember the first few times reading this parable, feeling a little sorry for this man. But when you realize he had 20 years worth of wages and he hid it in the ground, it changes things. The emotions move from sympathy to, you should get judged for not multiplying it. Especially when you read the next verse. In 19 it says, after a long time the Lord of those servants comes and reckons with them. It doesn't tell us a time, but the emphasis is clear. It was a long time. It was a far country. Each individual had a long time to multiply what they had. After this long period, the Lord returns and reckons with them. This means he took account. He wants to know what has happened since he left. Verse 20 starts the accounts of the three men. Pay attention to the first thing each man says because it's telling. About the first man with 5 talents, Jesus says, and so he that had received 5 talents came and brought other 5 talents, saying, Lord, you delivered unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more. As we already knew, he multiplied the goods given to him by his Lord. Let's see the reaction from his Lord in 21. His Lord said unto him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter you into the joy of your Lord. You get spoken well of. Multiplying the goods God gives you is a good, faithful, and warrants well done. But notice what the Lord in the parable calls the 5 talents, the 100 years worth of wages. He said, you have been faithful over a few things. You have been faithful over these small things. You will be ruler over many things, he says. Enter the joy of your Lord. In verse 22 to 23, we see the same thing with the second man. He gives his account. He had 2 talents, he multiplied them, his Lord congratulates him and rewards him for being faithful. Then verse 24 moves to the third man in the parable. Jesus spends the most time on him. Don't miss the message. Don't be like him is one of the reasons to do that. Verse 24 and 25 say, then he which had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew that you were a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not strawed. And I was afraid, and went and hid your talent in the earth. Lo, you have thine. This is a completely indifferent account. We knew all had the ability to multiply, but this man didn't. He says he was afraid, and his fear motivated him to hide the 20 years of wages in the ground. Now, after this long time, take it back. It's like you gave it to me. You would think this would be fine, but that is if you don't know who God is. Going back to Genesis 1 and the creation, God is in the business of multiplication and fruit. It's the same thing Jesus says in John chapter 15. God gets glory by his children producing fruit. And when you produce fruit, he will prune you to make more fruit. It's the same thing happening in this parable. This man who did nothing with such a set of goods is rejecting God's order. This is why verses 26 to 27 shouldn't surprise you. It says, his Lord answered and said unto him, wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I sowed not, and gather where I have not strawed. You should have therefore put my money to the exchangers, taken it to the bank, and at my coming I should have received mine own with usury, with interest. Not multiplying the goods is wicked, slothful, that means lazy, and disobedient to his Lord. He says, you knew that I reap where I sowed not, and gather where I have not strawed. Even though he sowed into the man 20 years of wages, I believe this is the Lord using the man's own folly against him. The Lord says, you should have gone to the bank at least and got interest on my money. That way, on my return, I would get what I gave you plus interest. This way, there would have been some multiplication at least. Interest was illegal for Israelites. This is one reason it puzzles commentators that Jesus said this. But I think it's the man using the foolish logic of the third man, like I said. If you are afraid, you didn't need to hide it in the ground. You could have given it to the bank to get interest. There's a few more verses to cover, but did you remember to notice what every man said first? The first 2 men started by saying, Lord, you. But the final man started by saying, Lord, I. I'll talk about the significance of that at the end. But notice the difference in the speech of the 2, those good, faithful, and wise, compared to the wicked, unfaithful, slothful man. Verse 28 to 29 might surprise you, but it lines up with everything from earlier. Take therefore the talent from him, and give unto him which has 10 talents. And give to the one who now has 200 years of wages the 20 years of wages the third man was unfaithful with. And he gives us the reason why. For unto everyone that has shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that has not shall be taken away even that which he has. God gives goods to people to multiply. If you don't, you will lose them. But that's not all. In verse 30 it says, And cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Punishment awaits those who have goods but don't use them to multiply it. They're called unprofitable, meaning the other two servants were profitable. God wants profitable servants, not unprofitable ones. Think about reading this parable on the backdrop of reading about the 10 virgins. It screams out, be wise and multiply. Don't be slothful and do nothing. But also notice this is a financial parable. The reason this shouldn't surprise you is because Matthew was a tax collector. He was familiar with money and speaks about money more often in his gospel than the other 3 gospels. I have 3 takeaways for you. The first is how most understand this parable is telling of the true meaning of it. Most think a talent is small. Likewise, thinking what God has given them is small and not valuable, when in fact, what God has given you is precious, valuable, and worth desiring. You must use it to multiply. Second, the first 2 men said, Lord, you first, while the third man, Lord, I first. The more you focus on the Lord first, the more you can achieve. But when you focus on yourself first, you allow limitations like fear to hold you back, like the third man did. And third, the things many think are major in life, like loads of money, are few things to God. We must believe in God's power more than any obstacle in our way. Sin is our biggest problem, but God's sacrifice more than pays the debt. How much more other problems we have in life when we take it to Him? If you have any questions about the parable or anything Bible related, let me know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. God bless.